the Valmiki Study Circle for giving me an opportunity to speak with and to engage with and to interact with the bright students of this great institution. That's not a loaded statement, it's an honest statement. So the idea is to give as many people as possible a shot at me through the interactive session and see if I have the ability to withstand your onslaught. So I will keep this so-called monologue to at best about 25 to 30 minutes, and close to an hour is dedicated to the interaction. Rest assured, I haven't planted selective plants here and there to ask me convenient questions. This will be as open as possible. The only rule of engagement that I observe, and I would request you to observe that, keeping with the legacy of your institution, is observe civility in the manner in which you engage. Feel free to ask whatever you think is relevant to the subject. I will respond to the best of my abilities. Should I find myself short of depth and knowledge, rest assured I'll be the first one to plead ignorance. Okay. This subject was chosen largely because I've anyway been accused of being a divisive figure. So I thought, why not divide further? So I've anyway been given these wonderful certificates and labels over the last few years, ever since I've started my public interactions. There's no point in trying to convince the other side. So I might as well do what I wish to and see how it goes. So I think broadly, the topic is a saransh or a single line summary of the writing exercise that I began about 2 years ago. Let me first give out what I know and what I don't know, so that the audience has a clear picture of what my strengths and weaknesses are in terms of my areas of qualification or areas of experience first. As an engineer turned lawyer, my interest in history has been that of a layperson, and perhaps slightly more than that of a beginner. And fortunately, law as a subject requires me to not just look at the legislative culmination of a particular thought, but the history of the thought itself. Its political history, its cultural backdrop, and its religious motivations or political theological, let's say, triggers or seeds, so to speak. There seems to be a lot of echo. Am I audible? Okay. So, around the time of 2019, which I felt was a fairly momentous year, for multiple developments took place in that year, which triggered, I think, a massive churn in this country, and we are still in the throes of that particular churn. I think it started with 5th of August 2019 with, it's not the abrogation of 370 because 370 still stands, it's the amendment of 370. Second, of course, you had multiple developments around November. I think one was the Ayodhya judgment. Then you had, of course, the CAA, which had been in discussion since 2016 at the very least, and even before that. And then, of course, you had the review order in the Sabarimala judgment, which effectively put pause to the 4-1 verdict of 28th of September 2018. Following that, I think, from March 2020, the country and society at large had a lot of time on its hand, thanks to the lockdown, to perhaps revisit and reconsider several of its closely held positions, regardless of which side we were from, so to speak, ideologically speaking. And that period, I think, has contributed to a massive shift in what I would call the Overton window, in terms of people's thinking patterns, in terms of the consumption of the material, in terms of knowledge production and content production. And fortunately, the lockdown gave me the breather I needed from my professional commitments to perhaps put out a comprehensive document capturing my position, which was until then presented through multiple lectures on different topics. So there were several bindus across the board, but there was not a single document capturing those bindus in terms of presenting a master template of what I think about some of these subjects. But what I think about some of these subjects, why should it make a difference to anyone? I'm a nobody, why should it make a difference to anyone? It just so happens that by then, a lot of criticism had come that yes, this gentleman seems to have spoken on several subjects, but is he capable of delivering a book? Because that is the touchstone of academic credentials. So said the gatekeepers of intellectualism in this country. And therefore I had to respond. The good part was, while most people saw each of these reactions and developments of 2019 as disparate events, I felt there was a certain continuum to it and there was some kind of a underlying commonality, both in terms of the cause as well as the reaction. And at one point, I think I've said this before, around the time of the CA, when I referred to India as Bharatana, but in a particular tweet, a student, a master's student of Indian origin studying in the United States basically accused me of being a partisan cultural fascist for using the word Bharat, because the use of word Bharat apparently went against the grain and notion of secularism when referring to India. So these were people who fashioned themselves and who thought of themselves as constitutional patriots. So to respond to them in their own language, I had to show Article 1 of the Constitution, which effectively said India, that is Bharat. And true to the ethos of free speech and liberalism that this particular camp subscribes to, I was immediately blocked. Because facts I don't think are palatable. Propaganda is, but facts are not. And that got me thinking. Around April 2020, while I think we were still rather reeling from the first wave, April 14th happened to be the Ambedkar Jayanti, and there was an occasion for me to interact with a Hindu American audience. I wouldn't want to use Indian American because it was largely Hindu American, and I think predominantly Hindu American. And I'm not sure how many of them actually continue to have any kind of citizenship, so to speak, as far as Bharat is concerned. So during the course of that interaction, I also realized that, or rather I was told, that perhaps it was time for me to seriously give decoloniality as a school of thought some serious thought, and also see how its application from a Bharati perspective could be presented before a larger audience. The other trigger, of course, was the participation in the Padmanabha Swami temple case, which gave me an opportunity to understand the thought process behind the entire episode of accession of princely states to the Indian Union, and specifically in the context of the Travancore princely state. Now, in the process of making the case for the Travancore princely state or its royal family's control over that particular temple, we were forced to look at the history of other princely states and other royal families, from Mewar to Kashi, to the Gajapati of Odisha, to the northeast, to Kashmir and whatnot. Interestingly, most of these princely states seemed to have their own deities, their family deities. So just as you have Eklamji for Mewar, you have the Jagannath for that particular state, and then you have Chamundeshwari for Mysore. Each of these deities had some kind of a relationship. And interestingly, when they chose to negotiate with the Indian Union on the element of accession, one of their primary conditions that the cultural ethos of their states, as well as their rights over their deities, shall not be interfered with. Now that made me wonder, if these were the terms of engagement between the princely states and the Indian Union, when did this translate to a secular country? If the constituents of a whole seem to subscribe to a particular religious identity, coupled with the fact that these discussions were happening during the bloody days of partition and post that, are we to believe that the lesson that was drawn post this particular experience was one of secularism? That seemed to be the question that I wanted to address. But this is not a question of opinion, this is a question of evidence and research and fact. Now that is what effectively triggered the discussion. So largely, the writing exercise has been devoted to understanding the origins of the fault lines that divide this country at this point, from a religious perspective, from a linguistic perspective, from a caste perspective, and whatnot. Now, if we were to accept these fault lines as the existing state of affairs, the question that you would be expected to ask is, what is the causality? What are the origins? Where do these problems come from? Are these internal? Are these foisted by external actors? Or is it a two-way street where an external actor foists it and the internal actor collaborates? These are the kind of questions that I wanted to address. And that has effectively taken the shape of the first two books. What was meant to be a trilogy will now be a tetralogy or a quadrilogy, as they call it. So the first book effectively covers the period from the Columbian expedition till the first constitution for pre-independent India, which is the Government of India Act of 1919. The second book covers the fall of the Mughal Empire from the 1740s to the end of the Khilafat movement of December 1924. The third book will cover the period from 1925 to 1946, when the idea of Pakistan had become a reality. And the final book will effectively cover the period from 1946 to 1950, looking deeply into the cogitations and deliberations of the Constituent Assembly to understand what was the position of the Constituent Assembly on the following issues: Bharatiya, religion, gender, language, caste, and the relationship between the union and the states, namely federalism. These are the 6 or 7 verticals that I will hope to understand as far as the fourth book is concerned. Because the Constitution as a subject is vast, but I am primarily approaching this particular document through the prism of identity, through the prism of civilizational identity. And therefore the idea is to understand whether there is some kind of a tenuous, tense, and strained relationship between the civilization and the Constitution. That is the broad, let's say, lay of the land as far as the books are concerned. One of the things that I have realized during the course of the writing of these books is that the Jati, Caste, Varna crucible is a poorly understood ecosystem. While there will always be a power struggle which is internal, which I think is a function of human psychology, whether the structure itself is meant to be a structure of exploitation, and second, whether this is the fundamental building block of Hindu Dharma. These are questions that I'm trying to understand. I have some tentative answers on some aspects of some questions. I don't think I'm still in a position to say I conclusively know everything. But this much I know for a fact, that a significant amount of history that is being pushed down our throats through certain guardians and through certain echo chambers is largely a function of dominance of a particular ideology, and may not have, dare I say in some aspects, has no basis whatsoever in facts of history. That is something that I've tried to address. So one aspect of the first book covers the question of caste, the question of pride, the question of language, the question of the relationship between pre-colonial societies and nature, and how colonization effectively changed that entire relationship by introducing certain definitions of development, by introducing certain notions of how nature is to be seen by humankind, so on and so forth. The second aspect that the first book touches upon are these notions of modernity, rationality, liberalism, so on and so forth, and whether they have secular connotations or secularized connotations despite having Christian origins. That's a very specific question that I've asked. The third aspect which I touched upon in the first book briefly is the aspect of Middle Eastern coloniality, because the first book predominantly discusses European colonization, but since we are not Latin America, which was fortunate enough to be staved or let's say protected from Middle Eastern coloniality, so to speak, or Islamic or Mughal invasion, so to speak, as Bharat, since we have seen two different waves of colonization and expansion, it didn't make sense to not touch upon the other aspect. And therefore, the colonization, so to speak, prior to European colonization also merited a significant degree of discussion, Because in the absence of that, two-nation theory cannot be understood in its entirety, and therefore the entire spectre of partition cannot be understood in its completion, and therefore the impact of partition on the constitution can also not be understood. So the second book took the discussion of the first book from the perspective of Middle Eastern coloniality, and I have tried to ask whether this creature called Ganga Jamni Tehzeeb is mythical or real, whether there is something to be called as the composite syncretic culture of this country, and second, whether two-nation theory is to be attributed to somebody like Savarkar or to the Muslim League, or is Muslim League itself a third generation or fourth generation torchbearer of a particular idea which preceded them by at least 150 to 200 years. These are the hard, politically incorrect, sensitive, delicate, uncomfortable questions that I've tried to touch upon. And that, I think, gives you a fair picture of where I stand with respect to the fault lines that afflict this country. So, the net result of this incomplete exercise at this stage is, whether we like it or not, I think two-nation theory as a reality needs to be dealt with. And I don't think the creation of Pakistan put an end to the two-nation theory. Perhaps the two-nation theory is no more pushed as two-nation theory, but it has acquired new avatars. And I have specifically said this in the book, that perhaps it has taken the form of a much more secular, politically incorrect, sanitized version called the majority-minority debate. And the good part of the literature that I've dealt with specifically shows that the opposition to the introduction of Western-style democracy in Bharat primarily came from the Muslim League because they felt that Hindus would outnumber them 4-1, and therefore they would have absolutely no representation in an independent parliamentary-style democratic Bharat. And that triggered the discussion for separate electorates, which gradually crystallized and avalanched to the discussion for a separate homeland altogether, with green, white, and a crescent as its flag. So, I think the discussion around the subject is it has three different verticals. One is whether the aspect of internal colonization that is constantly discussed, which is within the Sanatana Dharma, so to speak, does it have any basis? Second, what are the impacts of external colonization, which has two limbs, the Christian European limb and the Middle Eastern Islamic limb? These are the issues that I've addressed. Now that effectively sets the tone for what I've said so far, what I've written so far. Beyond this, I don't wish to take away your time in terms of coming after me for questions. So shoot, go ahead.